But yeah, both of us, we're two of the co-founders of Momentum, which was the campaign that grew out of Jeremy Corbyn's first Labour leadership campaign back in 2015, and campaigns in and around the Labour Party. And both of us worked there as its national organisers for the first couple of years of its existence, and then subsequently have been doing a whole bunch of work, mostly with a group called the Social Practice. So the Social Practice is a small ideologically driven organisation that supports progressive organisations, campaigns and candidates to run big organising campaigns that empower volunteers at scale. It was set up by Becky Bond and Zach Mallitz. Becky, some of you may have read...
In the US, yeah.
Yeah, based in the US. Some of you may have read Rules for Revolutionaries, How Big Organising Changes Everything, which is a book that Becky co-authored following her time as a senior advisor on the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. So yeah, we've been working and sharing experiences from things that are happening in the UK and other things happening in the US and internationally. And there's obviously so much overlap and similarity between the different movements and struggles and campaigns that are taking place internationally. So yeah, as I said, that's who we are. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to hand over to Adam now to take us through the purpose of the call and the agenda.
Great, cheers Emma. Yeah, the aim of this webinar is to give you a crash course in planning and delivering effective online barnstorms or activist calls, combining the overarching strategy also with the nuts and bolts of how to make it happen. And how we're planning to structure the call is to firstly explore the theory behind the approach, including its origins in the Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign, as Emma just mentioned. Then we'll look at the purpose of the tactic, so where it sits with your campaign or project cycle and how you might structure the call. Next, we'll give you some time to reflect in small groups, so it's not just all us talking, about how you might use this tactic to support your own organising work. And we'll then come back together to run through the nuts and bolts of planning and delivering a call. Like each state, there is really sort of a scientific formula that does work, of having it very structured and knowing exactly who speaks when and in what order, in order to have the most effective outputs. And that's been tested in lots of different places. And then you'll have another chance to do some planning yourselves in small groups or twos or threes, to give you an opportunity to talk and think around what's relevant to you. And then we'll aim to answer any questions people may have.
Cool. So yeah, just before we dive in, we wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge the moment that we're all living in right now, because it's pretty intense. We're months into a global pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement shining a spotlight on the structural and systemic racism within our societies. And then there's like all the usual things that we've had going on of existential climate threat, poverty, inequality, and just to mention a few things. So there's a lot going on, and from reading about the work that many of you do, it's probably fair to assume that you're also under a lot of strain and pressure. And I suppose we felt it was important to acknowledge that from the get-go and to make space for it, because I think, when we talk about tactics and techniques, it can sometimes feel a bit clinical or a bit disconnected from what it's all really about. And while this training webinar is going to be, just that, a training, we wanted to hold that deeper commitment to the purpose of what it's all really, about, what we're working towards throughout it as well.
And a recognition of this time and moment being one that's quite discombobulating, as Robin would say.
Yeah, exactly. Great word. So yeah, also on a practical note, if anyone has any technical or content questions as we go, feel free to post them in the chat. We'll try to, in fact, first thing might be just to make sure that everybody's muted themselves for now. But there will be an opportunity to ask questions and to share things a little bit later. We're just conscious of having a number of people on the call and a fair bit to get through. So as I said, we'll do our best to address any tech issues right away, and then we'll either respond to the content questions as we go, and there'll certainly be an opportunity at the end if there's not, if things haven't been covered already. So yeah, hope that's okay for everybody.
Okay, so let's get started. The outbreak of coronavirus and subsequent lockdown has increased the use of online calls for organisers and campaigners across the board, as we all know and are experiencing. Like Emma says, seeing two faces, and it's unusual to see faces next to each other on a computer screen, unlike a few months ago when Zooms would be in offices more. And just like in-person meetings, there are many different types of online meeting. So there can be discussions, rallies, planning sessions, trainings, and so on. And while online calls can serve many purposes, this training will specifically focus on online barnstorms, or organising calls, as they're sometimes called. And this type of online meeting is based on the in-person Barnstorm model, pioneered in the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. And also Momentum have used that sort of model over time. And I've seen it used effectively, been part of it, used effectively in a number of different settings, different groups and campaigns for different reasons, purposes. And organising calls can be a powerful mobilisation and organising tactic, which help you to funnel volunteers into your campaign at scale and build leadership through enabling people to take on meaningful and strategic roles. So things where they feel that it's worthwhile what they're doing and it feels purposeful and enjoyable. But to best utilise the number of people, the aim always being to build things at scale. And differently to an online rally or discussion, organising calls are most effective at the point when you already have the campaign goals and strategy pinned down and the infrastructure in place, so that you're ready for a big influx of people who can get involved straight away. And I think that's probably the most key thing to hammer home, in that the worst thing that can happen, and I've also been part of this as well over time, is when a big organising model is introduced, or when whatever a campaign is, it's opened up for large numbers of volunteers, but it hasn't been thought through in advance exactly how to utilise those volunteers or exactly what they'd be doing. And that ends up being much more stressful and creating chaos. And in that situation, you'd be far better off not opening it up at all in the first place. But as long as the campaign goals and the strategy is already sort of understood in advance to enough of an extent, then it's great to have more and more people coming on board. It doesn't drain capacity, it just adds to capacity, and it doesn't mean people having to react and adapt to problems that the big volunteer influx could create. And like with an in-person Barnstorm, the aim of an organising call is to convert as many of the attendees to become active volunteers as possible. And that's the fundamental defining feature of an organising call, and what separates it from other types of online meetings. So it's not just delivering content or training or whatever else, but it's about, at the end of the call, with the aim being 90%, or however many people as possible will then be doing concrete things to enable that campaign to operate at scale.
Great. So I'm going to just sort of dig in a little bit more to the purpose of the online Barnstorm tactic. So as I mentioned before, we've been working with Becky Bond over the last few years, and she was part of the team that really pioneered a lot of this big organising work on the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, which we've seen a lot of parallels for over here, and other groups like Extinction Rebellion, who've seen huge and impressive levels of mobilisation. And I suppose, so what really happened on that, the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign, is that you had a staffed campaign for the first few states that were being contested. And because obviously, we all know the story to some extent, that Bernie Sanders was such an outsider, there wasn't the investment in the other, 47 states of the US where there was no staff investment whatsoever. So there was one small team of a few digital people, or people with a digital background, who were then expected to organise volunteers across, the other 47 odd states. And that's really where a lot of this innovation came from, was trying to solve that problem of how that we've got all of these volunteers who want to get, who want to help the campaign, there's no sort of traditional staffed campaign that they can get involved in. And but there's good work that they could be doing to contribute towards a bigger goal. And the Barnstorm was like one of the sort of key things that really came out of this, that came out of that campaign, which essentially were often volunteer run events, initially staff and then volunteer run events in town halls, physical meetings, all across the US. They were scripted, so they were very easily replicable, and anybody could go and deliver one. And they, encouraged lots and lots of people to come to this particular place at a particular time. They received an update from the campaign about how things were going and what the sort of big strategy of the campaign was, and then broke down very concretely what the volunteer work was that needed to be done. And obviously that was an electoral setting, so the work was, canvassing and voter contact work at that point. But you can draw a lot of learning from this technique, even if you're not working in an electoral setting. So, and they found that this was like a really, really effective way of getting volunteers signed up to specific shifts, for, in that instance, canvassing all at once. And so that people would leave that meeting, rather than just having come to hear somebody else speak, they all left with a firm commitment and a time and a place where they were going to be volunteering. And that was a really key ingredient of how they were able to get to scale. So I think the key thing then with the online Barnstorm, so obviously that's taking a lot of those principles and doing it online, is that it should come at the point in your campaign or your project where you're ready for that big influx of volunteers. And that doesn't mean that you need to be working in an electoral setting by any stretch of the imagination. So, but what you do need to be is very clear about the goal of your campaign or your project and the plan that you have for achieving it. And in addition to that, something that Adam's already alluded to is having a really clear idea about the role that volunteers have to play in that plan being successful, and concretely what the work is that needs to be done. So, for example, we were working with the Trade Union Congress, the TUC, earlier this year, and helped them to launch a campaign to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. And the team had identified that as a result of the 2019 general election, a parliamentary strategy that they were planning to pursue for changing the legislation around preventative sexual harassment was no longer going to be particularly fruitful. So they adopted a workplace strategy instead, and they wanted workplace after workplace to introduce preventative sexual harassment policies and practices. So the reason I'm sort of saying this is because the team had already really clearly identified what their goal was and what the strategy was, and they had a very clear understanding about the role of volunteers within that plan. And then they also, prepared the necessary resources and infrastructure. So in this case, the volunteers were asked to start a workplace conversation about preventative sexual harassment practices and send a letter to their employer with a set of recommendations. So yeah, just to give you that sort of one example, so that it's clear that the point where you would use this tactic of the online Barnstorm at the point where you're ready to kind of open the floodgates and say, right, loads more people, you can come in and get involved. So it's, for this tactic, it's not at the discussion stage or the strategy stage or the planning stage. It's at the stage where it's okay, everybody in. This is our goal. This is our plan. We're off.
And as you'll all know, it depends on what you're working on and what the campaign is. But there may well be times when it's not appropriate to open up in this way. So, but the purpose of this training is when it is appropriate. When actually being able to achieve things by a small staff team feels too big a task, and there's the ability to draw people in. So there's an electoral campaign is a good example, but any context where it's likely that people will be attracted to the work and will want to continue doing that work because they'll feel part of something bigger, and whether that's electoral or sort of workplace campaign or whatever. But that's when you want to welcome it up, open it to as many people as possible. What happens on the call? A typical organising call will be structured along these lines. And as I was saying earlier, it is pretty sort of formulaic. So the first thing, the host welcomes and opens the call, outlines the agenda and sets the tone. And you could opt for either one or two hosts. And if you have two, they should be in the same physical location. Because Emma and I have worked together quite a lot from the same place, and we normally are on different computer screens. And so we're not, but in a situation like this, we were talking about it, to host, it's so much more effective when the two people are next to each other. And I've seen that again happen during lockdown, some online calls where it's in two places and the timing doesn't necessarily quite work. So it's normally best for one person to be a host, but another person could play a different role. So say in your organization, you wanted to platform two people on the call, one person play the host role and then another person play another of the roles. And I'll talk about them now. So firstly, the host welcomes and opens the call, outlines the agenda, sets the tone. And then secondly, speaker one comes in. So in total, you'd have three speakers, the host and three speakers. And speaker one would give the sort of background, top line strategy and share the plan to win. And this could be a high profile speaker, someone famous or a leader or a person who can speak with authority on the topic. So it could be an expert, it could be a celebrity, it could, whatever, depends on the content.
But I guess the key thing is it doesn't have to be a high profile speaker. It can just be someone who's speaking with authority on the particular topic. But if you did, if depending on what the context is, that this could also be the opportunity to, call in, to bring somebody else in to help you to get more people on the call in the first place, who you're then trying to convert into volunteers.
Absolutely. So speaker one, top line strategy, and they share the plan to win. And then speaker two would be speaking from personal experience, and the purpose of that is more for motivation. So this may be someone directly affected by the issue the campaign is addressing, who can speak from personal experience. But I suppose, the first one is sort of like top line strategy. This is what we're here for. This is what we're trying to do. And then the next one is more emotive, potentially more, personal experience. And then the host would come back in, and the host would make the big organising ask. So at the end, what we need you to do is sign up to this, or whatever the ask is. The host would be the person who then makes that. And then speaker three would come in. So fifthly, speaker three would come in. Firstly host, then speaker one, then speaker two, then back to host, like stage 4. And then stage 5 of the call would be speaker three coming in. And that would be more peer-to-peer sharing, and the idea being encouragement as well. This could be a grassroots activist who's taken the action before, or who has already signed up to volunteer this time, and they can share their personal experience and offer peer support. And the main aim there is for people to think, oh, well, it is possible. People who might be doubting whether they can do it or not sure how it would work. It's seeing someone else sort of like them, as it were, like another volunteer, just explaining that process and how they took part in the action and what they did. So that's the fifth thing. And then the sixth point is 7 points in total. The sixth point would be the host would make that organising ask again. So they came in at point 4 to make the ask after there was the background top line strategy and the personal experience. They came in again at fourthly to make the big organising ask, and then they'll come in again after the speaker 3 has given their sort of peer-to-peer sharing experience. And then after making the ask that second time, the host would then wrap up. So that's like 7 stages. Host welcomes, then speaker 1 comes in, then speaker 2, then back to host, then speaker 3, then host makes the organise and ask again, and then finally host wraps up.
So and we're gonna dig in a bit more to the data capturing and how you'd actually capture the information of the people who are signing up to volunteer on the call a bit later. But just a flag for now that when the host is making that big organising ask, as Adam was saying, a link would be posted into the chat box on the Zoom, which people would be directed to sign up to multiple times and enthusiastically. And then that would capture the name and contact details and any other key information that you need, which you can then use to follow up with them straight after the call. And the ask can be pretty much anything, as long as it's really clear how it fits into your plan to win. And I think, you know, volunteers need to feel like it's a good use of their time. So yeah, I gave you the example from the TUC just before. But one other is that we've been working with National Nurses United, who are the largest nursing union in the US, a really great female-led union, and they do some really amazing organising work, and they're really at the heart of the Medicare for All campaign for free universal healthcare in the US. And they hosted one of these calls. They had about 8,000 people on the call, and
scale in the US is obviously just different gear to the UK.
Yeah, that's true. And they had I think like 87% of the people who attended the call then signed up to host a canvassing session. And the ask was basically around canvassing people in particular constituencies about going door to door and speaking to people about Medicare for All, and gauging whether or not they were supportive, and then asking them to lobby their representatives if they were. So yeah, as another example. And I guess the key thing here is just to remember that, like, it's about trying to find meaningful work for people to do. That's, as I said, like really contributing to that overarching plan to win. So yes, the fun stuff. We're gonna whistle stop tour through choosing the platform, capturing data, scheduling, the script and the follow-up. So first bit, choosing the platform. In some ways, I feel like this has actually become quite a bit easier. So when we first started doing these kind of calls over the last couple of years, there was, you know, a bit of sort of deliberation about the different platforms, but it seems that Zoom in particular has like really taken off during lockdown. So it does feel like the you know, the most useful place to start, because obviously people are going to be most used to using it. All of the different options, like we've also done these calls using phone software called Maestro, where people call in, so it's not video. And you know, there's obviously Microsoft Teams and other platforms as well. But yeah, as I said, they all have like different pros and cons, but overall it seems that most people are familiar with Zoom, so that would be the place to start. In terms of capturing data, and this is like really, really crucial. You know, you really need to think about, before you set off on this endeavour, what is the information that you need to capture, and you probably, in most instances, will want to capture the people who have signed up or registered interest in the call, or RSVP to the call, and the people who obviously then on the call agree to volunteer. And those are like the two kind of different data sets that you really want to come away with. If you used Maestro, you would, or some of the other platforms, but unfortunately not Zoom, you'd also be able to get the data of the specific people who joined the call. But on Zoom, that unfortunately isn't currently possible. So yeah, with Zoom, you'll just get the people who signed up before, and then obviously the people who signed up to volunteer. And in terms of capturing the signups before the call, so people who've registered interest, you know, the most straightforward way to do that is to use the sign up form that Zoom provides for registration. There's some benefits to doing that, because it sends an automatic email to them with the link for the Zoom, and also you can set it so that they'll receive a reminder email at a particular time before the call starts. And we'd also really recommend that you collect people's phone numbers if you can. You can add that as a sort of a custom option on the Zoom registration form. And you need to make sure with all of this that you're GDPR compliant, obviously, and that you're giving people a box to opt in to further communication. It's really key that you get that, so that you can add these people to your kind of centralized mailing list or CRM, depending on what you're using. But if you collect people's phone numbers, you can use things like MessageBird or other software to send everybody a text message, which is pretty inexpensive, before, half an hour before the call. And we've really found that hugely increases the turnout of people who've RSVP'd than those who actually sign up. So yeah, we definitely recommend doing that. And then in terms of capturing the data of the volunteers on the call itself, so the people who've said like the equivalent of, yes, I'll stand up, I'll put my hand up, I'm up for doing this thing that you're asking me to do. You know, we've seen this happen really successfully on Zoom through basic CRM forms. You know, if you've got a CRM that you're using, or you can use a Google form or Airtable or Typeform, any of the kind of free online basic forms work perfectly well. But again, if you're collecting people's personal information, make sure you've given them the GDPR compliant opt-in box, because you want to be able to contact them about all of your future campaigns, not just about this specific thing. So you will need to put the opt-in in. And again, just like make sure you've thought through like what is the information that I need from an organising perspective to be able to get going with these people and to follow up with these people who have signed up to volunteer. And it's always a balance between, you know, getting everything that you need, but also not making the form so long that nobody, you know, the people give up halfway through. So, but yeah, again, I think the key thing from an organizer perspective I always find really helpful is the phone number, because it's a way obviously that you can just get on the phone with people or drop them a text message or WhatsApp.
Which is pretty cheap. Yeah, what does it tend to work out? It depends on.
Yeah, it's like, so for instance, I organised a call a few weeks ago, and we had about 150 people who'd signed up, and we sent them all a text message, and it cost less than £5. So it's yeah, I don't know, you price it up from platform to platform, but it's not super expensive. Yeah, okay, I'll hand over to Adam for scheduling.
Great. So yeah, I mean, this is pretty obvious really, like choose a time and date for your call. Be mindful to avoid unnecessary clashes. And the feedback we've received from other projects is that people with young children tend to prefer a slightly later evening call, so they can join after they've fed their kids and put them to bed. Obviously, that's also, other people like to end their working day. You know, they might have an hour or two window when they finish work, but then they want to stop. But generally, between 7 and 8:30 p.m. start times. Between 7 and 8:30 for the calls work well. So starting at either 7 or 7:30 or 8. But trying to finish by 8:30. And yeah, but I know some people with young children, 7 is a bad time. But not 6. I think 6 is like worse. That's what we discovered, that actually it's better to wait. Yeah, I can see Becky nodding. But yeah, waiting from not doing it immediately after the working day, but a little bit of a break. And depending on the platform you use, you'll need to pay close attention to the settings you select for the call. For example, you can choose participants to enter the Zoom call automatically on mute, whether you want them to receive an email reminder, etc. And whether there's a waiting room or whether they just come in straight away once they've clicked on the link. In terms of recruitment, generally speaking, we'd suggest allowing a 1 to 2 week public recruitment period for your call. So not, if you advertise too far in advance, you lose a sense of urgency, and people may not commit to holding the time free in their diaries in the way they're more likely to for an in-person event. So yeah, in person, planning in advance obviously tends to work, but when it's an online thing, obviously it feels normally that much more casual. So the drop-off rate is higher when it's advertised earlier in advance. So yeah, 1 to 2 weeks is what we advise. However, it's also a good idea to engage with specific groups or networks you're aiming to reach in advance of publicly launching the call, and this can help you build the relationship, etc., like beforehand, and so they know, yeah, you build that up in good time. And your promotion content, so email, social media, texts, digital ads, influencers, advocates, etc., should all direct people to the sign up registration form for the call. So any promotion content directing everyone to the sign up form. And as Emma said, it's great to make sure that on that form you get their phone number as well. So you could, depending on what you're doing, you can make phone calls, but also you can send out those texts, which are pretty affordable. And if you also set up a Facebook or online event page, make sure you make it clear that people need to register for the call in addition to attending the event. So they need to register first. Just make that really clear in communications.
The other thing, just to say, because obviously you can have public, so you can have the Zoom meeting set up so that you don't need registration. Now, as we said, we would obviously suggest that you do require registration, because that is a really helpful way for you to capture the data. But been part of some projects where they've wanted as many people as possible to come, so they've just literally posted the Zoom link, up on Twitter or on social media, or WhatsApped it round to everyone they know. And you can do that, but obviously you just need to kind of think. So that would mean that anybody could just like click on the link then and there and join the call.
You will likely get higher numbers if you do that.
So yeah, you're likely to get higher numbers, but we've also found, and it will depend on the field in which you're operating, that there's a higher percentage of trolls who just sort of opportunistically see something shared around on Twitter and think, oh, I'll go and be an idiot in that, make myself a nuisance there. So, and then I guess in terms of sort of dealing with any hostility from people within the Zoom meeting, in the guide that we'll send around after the meeting, there's actually like some really helpful techniques that you can use, but obviously you can block if there are people posting anything that is abusive in any way or discriminatory in any way, you can remove people and bar them from re-entering. So these are just some things to be aware of, and we generally find that having the registration in advance mitigates against some of that, because people can't just opportunistically follow a link on something they've seen on Twitter.
It also means you collect the data.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, then it comes to the script itself, and in our experience it is really, I'd probably go as far as to say essential or very, very, very advisable that you write out a script for the call itself. And then, that just means that you can ensure that the time is used well, all the key messages are conveyed, and crucially that the organising ask itself is optimally crafted and delivered. And if you're using Zoom, then you can have the host, you can have them reading off the script on the same computer that they're running the Zoom through. So you don't have to have people with bits of paper or looking over at other screens. So yeah, it just sort of looks like they're looking at the camera itself. And Adam ran through the kind of structure of the call, and you can play around with that a bit. You can incorporate additional speakers and different perspectives, but I suppose the key takeaway thing that we would say is that we really recommend keeping the purpose of the call in mind, which is I want as many of the people who attend this call as possible to leave as signed up volunteers for this project or this campaign. So you really want the whole kind of, the purpose, that all of the different contributions and anyone who's speaking to really be honed in to supporting the organising ask that's made. And, when you've got the person who's giving that background or that top line strategy and sharing what the plan is, you should be able to see a really clear line between what that the plan is and then what the individual volunteer is being asked to do, so that if they are that person with 1 hour a week, they know that it's being really well used. And then sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
But yeah, that's also different to what Rebecca, for example, was saying about wanting people to maybe feed into the strategy. That would be a separate call, as you said. So this is it's kind of a scientific formula, and in a way, if the organisers are motivated by, what percent, how many people can we get on the call, and what percentage conversion rate can we get from people who've signed up, who then go out and do something, and it's sort of viewed like that. So in some ways, the call itself is sort of it's a means to an ends, and the ends is simply to get people to be doing the thing that you've discussed. But it doesn't. But even though that's how it's thought of, how it's conceptualized by the organisers, it obviously shouldn't feel like that at all, and it needn't feel like that, because it's participatory, it's jolly, it's fast paced, but with a continual reminder from the host about making sure the organising ask is made. And yeah, on that also, therefore, all speakers should have a clear brief and script where possible, as Emma said, and the host should be the one who's responsible for timekeeping and driving the agenda of the call. So actually, yeah, it's really the host who's thinking purely in those terms of getting it through and getting to the numbers, and everyone else plays their role within that. We strongly encourage asking an organiser to be the host rather than an expert or a leader or a thinker. So someone who understands that this is an organising call, as I was saying, with the purpose of maximising volunteer output at the end of it and having as many people sign up as possible. And we found that organisers are much more effective at delivering the organising ask and hammering it home, repeating it again and again. Mm-hmm. After all, it will be them who's following up with the volunteers the following day. So they're more likely to be driven to making the organising ask component of the call as strong as possible. It's also worth choosing someone who's clear, confident communicator and with an upbeat and positive style. But yeah, have tried it before with having more charismatic hosts, but they can often go off on tangents and forget the purpose. And whilst it may be entertaining, it's kind of frustrating if your aim is, the work done at the end of the call. And we recommend practicing the call in advance at least once. Hosts should familiarise themselves with the script and practice reading from it in a compelling way. And equally practicing with the platform, e.g. muting and unmuting speakers, posting links in the chat, etc., is essential to ensure the call goes smoothly. I mean, you were going to talk briefly about the tech as well.
Yeah. So basically, that's the kind of all of the people who are speaking on the call. But there'll be particularly if you're using Zoom, there'll be some other roles that you'll need to fill as well. So having a tech lead and a tech support person. So ideally, 2 people who are responsible between them for tech, and just making sure it's really clear what the breakdown of responsibility is. So the tech lead will, start the call at the right time. We'll keep people in the waiting room until the right moment. Send them a message, allow them into the meeting room. Mute and unmute speakers. Keep an eye on any trolls in the chat box, and obviously remove people if necessary. Suspend the chat box function if necessary or desired for a particular reason. And they have a tech support person who would support with all of the above. And also what.
So a tech lead and then a tech support.
Yeah, exactly. And so the tech support would support with all of the things that the tech lead is doing, but also would be responsible for posting the sign up link. So when your host is saying, okay, so this is the thing that we're asking you to do, please, we need people to step up and to sign the form now. And to really sort of hammer home the organising ask, the tech support person would at that point, post the link very clearly into the chat box. And what we've actually found was quite useful is to suspend the chat box at that point so that the link stays there. On some of the Zoom calls we've had before, if people are sort of chatting away, which is great, and you want that at other points in the call, sharing their experiences, the link is sort of like darting up and you have to keep posting it over and over again. So you can just suspend it briefly, during those moments when the organising ask is being made. And then in addition to the tech lead and tech support, it's worth having a few people who can perform the kind of hype builders role. So these aren't people who are like staff members in the organisation that you work for, or the people who are outside of the organising, but maybe people you can call in a favour from, and who are going to be on the call and who can just sort of comment positively about speakers and contribute in a positive and upbeat way. And because that just generally, it only needs 1 or 2 people saying, oh yeah, that sounds great, or well said. And then lots of other people also feel able to come forward, and respond in that way as well. So we'd definitely encourage having a couple of people who know that that's what their role is for the call itself.
So yeah, behind the scenes, as well as the hosts and the speakers, you've got your tech lead, your tech support and hype builders. And if there's not enough capacity, the tech support could also be a hype builder if there's only 2 people who are available behind the scenes. And then after the call, it's worth really thinking about that stage. So before the organising call itself, you should have the infrastructure and resources prepared for volunteers to be able to get to work straight away after they've signed up on the call. So we aren't suggesting letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. All the best volunteer processes are iterated over time, but we do think it's essential that the volunteers should be able to get plugged into the work right away, not left as email addresses on a database somewhere for weeks as the organisers figure out the next steps. And that's so knowing exactly what you want by the time you have the call. And if you're not ready, then I'd suggest postpone. That's also another reason to leave it only 1 to 2 weeks before publicly advertising the call, because you may realise, there's a tech problem or a few things we need to work out before we're ready. Because the idea is, once it's all planned out in advance, it's not stressful. You're just following a simple script. Everyone knows their roles behind the scenes, and when people click things, it takes them to particular places. And because what really doesn't work is having people really hyped up, really positive, cool, let's get to work. And then people are waiting a week or two, and then they get an email, because the drop-off rate is going to be much, much higher if you don't catch people while they're hot. And preparing the follow-up email sequence that volunteers receive after they've signed up is a really good idea to have done that in advance, and also in advance to have prepared resources and guides that volunteers need to get started, and preparing the communication channels that volunteers will use whilst working, for example, Slack or WhatsApp, and preparing staff and or super volunteers to onboard and absorb volunteers at scale in advance. So therefore, thinking it through so people are ready to then support people when they come in. This sort of guide is thinking about if you're doing it really at scale and it's big. Obviously, you can scale all that down if it's just a smaller community, but applying the same principles. And the most basic things is preparation and the delineation of roles and structure and script and data capture, outcomes.
And I think this also speaks to, was it Becky? It's got Becky's question before around the sort of training. And I think, again, this will just entirely depend on what the specific nature of your, work is and what the organising ask will be. As a general principle, we try and make training available where it's needed, but reduce where it's compulsory, unless, for the nature of the work, it's absolutely essential. But for a lot of things, we found, just speaking from my personal experience, the way I like to learn, and I think increasing numbers of people are like this, is in the process of actually doing. So if you think about the training in that way, so it's kind of integrated into the process of onboarding and then getting going.
Exactly.
It just it's almost like a conveyor belt, right? From saying, yes, I'll volunteer, and then the next thing I know, I'm doing this thing, and now I'm learning how to do it, and then I'm kind of in the system, and I'm and I'm in the flow of the work that I'm doing. Obviously, there'll be some instances where, if it's particularly sensitive work, or, it's particularly sort of high bar task, then, you'll need that. But I suppose the point is that
it shouldn't be open like this.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to probably be for a group of people who are already really invested in the project and have maybe been involved for some time, and you're sort of taking up onto that next step. The thing that we find is that if you kind of get people onto a call and then they've got to jump through another hoop of doing a training, a sort of mandatory training, the chances of people sort of falling off are just greater and greater. So you want to make it as sort of smooth as possible. But that's not to say that you obviously can't introduce training points. We just try and make things as routine as we can, in the sense of have an onboarding call for volunteers and do it every week at the same time, or twice a week, or again, depending on the nature of the organisation and the task, every day. If it was an election, for example, it would be every day. You can just join the volunteer onboarding call. A volunteer, that it's all scripted, so it can just sort of run itself.